Okay, thank you very much, Kathy. So for those of you in the talk that don't know me, looking through the names, I know quite a lot of the people that are here tonight. My name is Kensa Broadhurst, and as Kathy says, I'm very generously funded by the Cornwall Heritage Trust, my PhD studies at the Institute of Cornish Studies, with my supervisors, Gary Tredidja, who most people probably know, and Martha Van Dry, who you might not know. He's also in the history department. And as Kathy said, I'm actually looking for evidence in my research for the Cornish language being used in the period when it's generally believed to be extinct. So between the death of Dolly Pentreath, the so-called last speaker of Cornish in 1777, and the publication of Henry Jenner's Handbook of Cornish Language in 1904, which is the date that generally would take the modern revival of Cornish, which is still ongoing today. However, today I'm going to talk about the language in the period up to 1777, so the period before my research actually sort of then takes over, and discuss some of the reasons for the language's decline. So for those of you who don't know, Cornish is one of the 5 Celtic languages of the British Isles, and these are grouped into 2 branches: the Goidelic, which is Irish, Gaelic and Manx, and the Brythonic, which is Welsh, Cornish, and also Breton. So there are 6 Celtic languages in our region of Europe. Linguistically, it's likely that these started as one language, which split into its variant parts as the Celts were pushed further west during successive invasions of both mainland Europe and the British Isles. So before the Roman invasion of 43 AD, the island we now know as Great Britain was entirely Brythonic speaking, so that's the languages that then become Welsh, Cornish and Breton. 2 Christian memorial stones dating from the 5th and 7th centuries are written in both Latin and Ogham script, which is an early form of Goidelic Celtic script, so the language that then becomes Irish, Gaelic and Manx. The Menscrifa, found near Land's End, bears the inscription, and please excuse my Latin pronunciation, Rialobrani Cunovali Fili, which means Rialobran, son of Cunoval. This is possibly the first Celtic written example in Cornwall, and Rialobrani and Cunovali are possibly Latinized Cornish names, which mean respectively Royal Raven and possibly Famous Chieftain. So it's the Celtic names that have been Latinized, but they're in this really early stone. However, perhaps better known is the so-called Tristan stone, which was originally located at Castledor and now is situated closer to Foy, and its inscription, which is Drustanus ic Iacet Cunomori Filius. So here lies Drustanus, son of Cunomorus, the loose translation. And this is a possible memorial to Tristan, the fabled Tristan, son of King Mark, who ruled Cornwall between 570 and 585 AD. Then we've also got near St Clear 2 cross bases which are carved in an Irish style, so Celtic style, including one with the description Doniat rogavit pro anima. Doniat ordered this cross for the good of his soul. So we can see that even though the Romans didn't really occupy our region of Great Britain to any great extent, Latin, however, was making an impact on the language it used in the region, and it did actually influence the neologism of terms in Cornish. So we have words such as, for example, fenester, which means window, fisterna, which means to hurry, and it was used in official documentation, of course. So the separation of Wales and West Wales, which is current day Devon and Cornwall, begins with the Saxons in the 6th century. And this separation was soon reflected in the language. Until this time, the language spoken in the west and the southwest of Britain was homogeneous. It was that Brythonic Celtic language. There were probably differences of dialects, but the speaker would have been understood over the whole region. This is our understanding. Now that the Saxons stood between the Welsh and the West Welsh, so Devon and Cornwall, the languages of these 2 areas then begin to diverge into the early forms of Welsh and Cornish. So with each successive invasion in that first millennium AD, incursions are made into the area between Devon and Cornwall, and they culminate in the defeat of the Cornish by Athelstan, King of Wessex from 925 to 940 in 936 AD. And as a result of this defeat, the Cornish are driven out of Exeter and the Tamar is fixed as the boundary of Cornwall. Obviously, after the Saxons, we then get to the Normans, and the Normans didn't really interfere too much. Obviously, they settled overlords into areas of Britain, but they don't seem to have interfered too much with the Cornish language. Bernard Deacon, who I'm sure you all know, is a huge commentator on Cornwall, lots of areas of Cornwall and Cornish studies, including the history, concludes that it's only because the westernmost parts of Britain were able to retain degrees of independence throughout these invasions that the Cornish language actually survived beyond this period, beyond the Norman conquest. So amongst the first extant examples of written Cornish, as distinct from that Ogham script, that sort of what becomes written Celtic language, is the 12th century Vocabularium Cornicum, which is better known as the Cottonian vocabulary. And this names body parts, birds, animals, fish, herbs, trees, ecclesiastical and liturgical terms, and some adjectives. It also contains a calendar and lives of the Cornish and Welsh saints, and comprises nearly the whole body of what's called Old Cornish, along with this document here, which is part of the Bodmin Manumissions. So the Bodmin Manumissions are copies of the Gospels dating from the 9th or 10th century, on which were written the names of slaves who were given their freedom. They also contain a 960-word vocabulary in Cornish of celestial bodies, church and craft occupations, and the names of plants and animals. And there's lots of work going on, actually, with new work going on the Bodmin Manumissions at the moment. Okay. However, most of the extant corpus dates from Cornwall's rich history of medieval drama, which is almost unrivaled in England, although perhaps less well known outside Cornwall than the contemporary York and Chester mystery play cycles and the End Town cycle. So the Cornish mystery plays are the 3-part Ordinalia, which is coming to Cornwall later this year and will be performed in St Just. So that's Origo Mundi, Passio Christi, and Resurrectio Domini. And the miracle plays, Bunans Mariazic and Bunans K. So the difference is mystery plays talk about the life of Christ, and miracle plays talk about the lives of saints. Is the sort of simple definition between the two. And these were used, as with other dramas written at the same time, to illustrate biblical teachings to an illiterate population. And thus they were written in the vernacular language, so in this case Cornish. To our best knowledge and best guesses, the plays and a passion poem, which is called Passion Agonaloth, date from this period, were written to entertain and teach this illiterate audience about the events of Holy Week. So that's the passion poem. And they were written at Glasney College in Penryn, although there are arguments that they could have been written in Bodmin. Glasney was the key centre of learning in Cornwall during the medieval period. Rather than being a monastery, it was actually a collegiate church and housed secular canons instead of monks. We know from the length of these extant plays that they were staged over several days, and that as well as forming the intended audience, the local population would also perform the drama. Peter Beresford Ellis, who's written extensively on the history of the Cornish language, feels that this medieval literature in Cornish represents the high point of the use of the language, and that it kept the language alive in the face of pressure from English. So this is sort of 14th, 15th century. Okay. So I think Ellis is correct in emphasising the importance of plays in keeping Cornish alive as a vernacular language. However, I think there's a stronger case to argue that these works wouldn't have been written in Cornish in the first place if there wasn't already an audience and a need for them to be produced in the vernacular rather than in English. It's worth remembering they were being written and produced to instruct the general population on Bible stories and matters of doctrine at a time when England was still a Catholic country, and therefore with pre-Reformation and any possibility of the Bible being translated into the vernacular languages of the British Isles. The church knew it needed a means by which to instruct people in the language they used and understood, so in this case Cornish. Therefore, the combination of this need, the scholarship available at Glasney/Bodmin during the medieval period, and the strong presence of a local vernacular language resulted in the production of these works. Okay, I'm going to skip forward slightly, so excuse me for a minute, but we do go back. William Scowen, in 1680, wrote a book called Antiquarian Cornwall, The Causes of Cornish Speech's Decay. And in it, he gives 16 reasons for the decline in the use of Cornish. Included amongst these are two important religious factors. His fourth reason, which says, the giving over of the Gwairmears, which were used at the great conventions of the people. And his 14th reason, another cause, is that like care was not taken for us as for our brethren in Wales in the making of the Act for the Uniformity of Common Prayer. So why did Scowen's Gwairmears, which are the miracle plays, fall into disuse? And why were the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible not translated into Cornish, as they were into Welsh and Irish at the time of the Reformation? As a result of the Reformation, performances of these plays were brought to a halt, as they didn't sit within the new Protestant theology, which results in several consequences for the Cornish language. Not only did this mean that a wealth of extant literature written in Cornish fell into disuse, but the final dissolution of Glasney College by 1548, where it's believed these works originated, meant no more large-scale pieces of Cornish literature were being written. Changes in religious instruction meant the power to educate people on matters of scripture and modes of behaviour was being transferred from the church to the common man. And due to decisions being made not only in mainland Europe, but closer to home, this meant English, but not Cornish, became the language of religion. So as I'm sure many of you know, these changes did not sit well with the common people of Cornwall and culminated in the 1549 Prayer Book Rebellion. So in January 1549, the First Act of Uniformity decreed that English would be used in all church services from Whit Sunday that year, which is the 9th of June. Cornish protesters, led by Humphrey Arundel, gathered at Bodmin, where they drew up articles of supplication to the king. And these vary in number from 8 to 16 according to the sources, and were entirely conservative. They were concerned with religious demands such as retention of usage with regards to baptism, confirmation, communion, and so on. But most significant for us, however, is the 8th article, in which they say, we, the Cornish men, whereof certain of us understand no English, utterly refuse this new English. So this wasn't just a rebellion against changes to worship and liturgy, but a defence of the Cornish language too. The ordinary Cornishmen didn't want another language to be imposed upon them, even if, as the Lord Protector Edward Seymour himself pointed out at the time, they wouldn't have understood the Latin used in the old Roman Catholic masses that they were used to. English was being introduced into church services in order that people would understand what was happening and be able to have a more direct relationship with God, which is a key tenet of the new Protestant beliefs. And the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Thomas Cranmer, said that there were more people in Cornwall who understood English rather than Latin, but he was missing the point because Latin was familiar, if not understood, all across Cornwall, whereas English was not at this time. So this is the mid-1500s, mid-16th century. The Book of Common Prayer and the Bible were translated into Welsh, and through these, the Welsh people did accept the new religious changes. It's possible that the English government was concerned about the possibility of continental Catholic enemies goading the Welsh into insurrection, and yet this doesn't seem to have been a concern regarding the Cornish, despite their history of rebellion in 1497. And the idea of capitalising on the persecution of Catholics amongst the religious Cornish did occur to an Italian agent, II of Spain. This agent wrote to Philip in a letter which is now in Spanish State Papers of the British Museum, pointing out that, like the Irish, the Cornish were Catholics and a different race with a different language and customs from the English. And the Italian agent of Philip II thought the Cornish would be likely to help Catholic Spain in their wars against Protestant England. So why weren't the English authorities concerned about this? Well, Scowen, later on, at the beginning of the 17th century, alludes to a possible argument in his 14th reason for the decline of language, that the Cornish representative parliament at the time of the Act of Uniformity in 1549 didn't make the same efforts on behalf of the language as did their counterparts from Wales. They wanted the liturgy to be in English, to which they were then, for novelty's sake, addicted. Okay, so historians, this is the controversial bit, and I know some of my audience are not going to agree with me. Historians and language revivalists belonging to the Cornish nationalist school often either ignore and do not believe this possibility. So A.S.D. Smith, who's a key figure of the 20th century language revival, notes that there were many who resented a changed service book, and points out it would be a mistake to believe that the use of Cornish stopped as soon as Shakespeare began to write. Smith goes on to emphasise the further use of Cornish over the following century. So we'll come on to this. For example, a man called John Tregear starts translating sermons by the Bishop of London into Cornish. Scowen himself is writing well over a century after the events of the Reformation, and thus what was his source material for this claim? Did he have written evidence, or was he using the imperfect recollections of people who would themselves be recalling the testimony of previous generations? Richard Polwhele, a later Cornish historian at the beginning of the 19th century, argues that the gentlemen of Cornwall desired it might not be enjoined to them in Cornish, not pleading their ignorance of Cornish, but preferring the English for the sake of their mercantile and other connections. At the same time, we should presume that the common people understood a little English, as the legislator would hardly have forced the liturgy upon them in a tongue unknown. So Polwhele saying that the common people of Cornwall would have known a bit of English, but that the mercantile classes wanted everything in English. They wanted to get rid of the Cornish language. This is the controversial idea in the sort of Cornish nationalist historian point of view. So Richard Polwhele was a curate, so he's unlikely to have written anything portraying the Church of England in a negative light, but he does make a reasonable argument regarding the lack of support for the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible to be translated into Cornish. So those members of society with business links to the rest of England who perhaps regarded the use of English as their principal language as a necessity to interacting with the rest of the country at the same level, rather than hindering themselves by doing business through the medium of a translator. Upon his accession to the throne in 1485, Henry VII had rewarded his Welsh and Cornish supporters, and they started to gain high offices in court. Many Cornishmen, in order to climb up this social ladder in court, began to anglicise themselves. It seems implausible that Cornish would impact on the use of English to such a damaging extent if it had already been in use in the east of Cornwall for centuries, and it was common amongst the gentry of the west of Cornwall. There's also the argument that a specific request for the liturgy in English would hardly have been made unless the possibility of providing a liturgy in Cornish had been seriously raised first, something which, in turn, implies a degree of support for the latter proposition. So this all suggests a divided response to the idea of the liturgy in Cornish at the time, rather than a complete rejection. However, at the same time, in the sort of late Tudor period, there's another pressure on language, which is the opening up of sea routes, especially to the Americas, which encouraged a large number of Cornishmen to go to sea. So at this point, you start to see Cornishmen realising that Cornwall is a small entity in the world dominated by England, as England starts to go out to America. And Cornishmen, given that where Cornwall is, were well placed geographically to take advantage of the opportunities opening up with new trade routes on top of the traditional links to Britain, Wales and Ireland, the other Celtic nations. They're making careers for themselves at the highest levels of many disciplines, and of necessity needed to interact with others in English to carry out their day-to-day business, but also to gain advancement. Cornwall also, at this time, finds itself at the forefront of the defence of the realm, during the Slate Tudor period, and it's likely that there were more Englishmen in the region because of this. So these more political reasons why the Cornish people did not demand the prayer book be translated into Cornish have another aspect too. After the rebellions of 1479 and again in 1549, the Cornish start to gain a reputation as troublemakers, and by extension, the language too is tarred with the same brush. So the English-speaking gentry level of society needed to distance themselves from the language if they were to carry on advancing within Tudor society. So what better way of doing so, and at the same time striking at the very roots of the language itself, than by opposing the renewed calls from the common people for a Cornish liturgy. The upper sections of society obviously are the ones with the connections at court and in Parliament. They also have the literacy and the learning to appeal for Cornwall to follow the rest of England, rather than obtain their own translations of the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. Following the lack of success of the 1549 Prayer Book Rebellion, the only other means available to the common mass of Cornish people would have been to ask for a translation of the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, would have been through petitioning. And there's no evidence of this happening until 1560, so during the reign of Elizabeth I, when there was a petition. And of course, even then, this document would have required the involvement of literate English speakers to get it seen by the right people. So, in conclusion, the lack of pressure to produce Cornish translations of the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer actually does seem to originate from Cornwall rather than from court and from Parliament. Okay. And even then, actually, we have evidence of support for the language coming from the southeast. So in Thomas Cromwell's first injunction of 1536, he did specify that children and servants should be taught their paternoster, the articles of faith and the 10 commandments in their mother tongue. So therefore, Cornish servants and children could learn those in Cornish. And there's clear evidence that even the advanced Protestant party in England was not opposed in principle to the use of the Cornish language for religious reasons, because actually the petition of 1560 comes from Puritans, and they asked specifically that children who didn't speak English should be allowed to learn the catechism in Cornish. And it does seem that, you know, that they were these extreme Protestants that brought this petition. And in a way, this is unsurprising because obviously the Puritans placed so much emphasis on the importance of an individual's direct relationship with God. And there is evidence that Cornish was still being used in religious instruction and services after the beginning of the Reformation, and that its use was approved by the Church. So in 1538, after the dissolution of the monasteries, after the beginning of the Reformation, John Vasey, who was Bishop of Exeter at the time, actually specifically ordered that all or part of the epistle of or the gospel of the day, or else the Paternoster, Ave Maria, Creed and 10 Commandments should be read in Cornish in those parishes where English was not spoken. So how strict that order was carried out, I don't know. Okay. So dating this, obviously coming after the beginning of the dissolution of monasteries, so this does imply that there were still monoglot parishes within Cornwall. And the decline of Cornish is more an unintended consequence of religious reform rather than deliberate repression. And we know even as late as the mid-17th century, Cornish was still being used by members of the clergy, so supposedly educated men, in their communications. Around 1536, Mr. Drake, the Vicar of St. Just, sent marriage banns written in Cornish to Mr. Trithel, curate of Spenham. And the longest piece of extant Middle Cornish prose dates from the middle of the 16th century and was written by John Tregear when he translated this series of 12 sermons by the Bishop of London, Edmund Bonner, in around 1560. The set also includes a 13th unidentified homily sermon, which has a title in Cornish. And it's thought that Tregear was the vicar of Newlyn East, and that presumably he wanted his parishioners to hear these sermons written by the bishop, but in a language that they understood. And we also know that in the mid 17th century, William Jackman, who was the vicar of Fiach, was still using Cornish during Holy Communion because the older members of his parish didn't understand English. So not only did the Reformation change religious worship in Cornwall, but it also had an impact on links between Cornwall and one of its closest geographical and cultural neighbours, which is Brittany. So for centuries, Cornwall had had far more in common with Brittany than with the rest of England. Many inhabitants moved between the two peninsulas, and indeed many fled from Cornwall to Brittany in the aftermath of the Reformation. And the two languages are almost, common, stemming from the original Brythonic language from the Great Britain. And this lessening of contact with Brittany, which also actually became part of France in 1532, and therefore that makes it part of England's natural enemy, and Cornwall becoming a Protestant part of England, meant that these links, and therefore another reason for maintaining communication in Cornish, were severed. So not only have we got these religious reasons, sort of social reasons going on within Cornwall and England, but also actually a natural reason needing to speak Cornish is also being cut off. However, there is evidence which shows Cornwall was still being spoken in the east of the county towards the end of the 16th century, and these coming from court records. So in a case heard before the Bishop's Consistory Court in 1505, a girl mentions that while she was weeding a garden, she heard two women talking together in both Cornish and English. And this was in St Ewe, near St Austell. And then in a similar fashion, in another court case of 1572, recording events in Lelant, William Horsell gave evidence that, excuse the language here, the wife of Maurice David called Agnes Davy whore and whore bitch in English, not in Cornish, thereby showing that English is being used a long way to the west. So perhaps by abusing someone in English, Mrs. David was attempting to make her stronger, or to avoid retribution by hoping she wasn't being fully understood when using the lesser used and possibly less understood language of English. But these court cases are interesting because they imply that this idea of a westward retreat of the Cornish language was not as clear-cut as it's sometimes portrayed, with pockets of the language remaining in largely English-speaking areas and English making incursions into the Cornish-speaking West. We know that towns in Cornwall, the idea of towns, only start developing towards the end of the Middle Ages. And while pilgrims were travelling to St Michael's Mount, and we get the growth of certain key ports as the Tudor military expansion puts Cornwall right at the forefront of national defence. So English starts becoming quite widely disseminated within the county. However, there are still, as we all know, geographically isolated areas which wouldn't have had much contact with English. Okay, there's also some evidence to show that there was still a corpus of Cornish literature at this time. So dating possibly from 1550, in 1574, the second edition of a play is published called A Little Treatise called The Image of Idleness, containing certain matters moved between Walter Wedlock and Bawdin Bachelor, translated out of the Troyants or Cornish tongue by Oliver Oldwanton and dedicated to the Lady Lust. So this is basically a series of immoral platitudes on love and marriage, this play. And later, Henry Jenner thought that the play wasn't a translation out of Cornish, but just a trick to promote the book. However, there's no grounds for this assumption. Many manuscripts we know were lost, and this could be one of them. There were contemporary Bawdy, Irish and Welsh tales, so a play such as this could have been part of a wider Celtic literary tradition. We know that, for example, Nicholas Rescorrick wrote a Register of British Saints, which is currently in the Cambridge University Library, and the folio of that contains his translation of the lives of the Cornish saints from an original Cornish manuscript, which has been lost. And in a letter dated 7th August 1607 to Bishop Camden, Rescorrick mentions he also had a Cornish life of St Columba in his possession, which again is currently lost. Okay, So the early 17th century is when the commentary on the use or otherwise of Cornish's vernacular language begins to be noticed by people and commented on specifically. And so it's from these that we begin to get a picture of the decline of the language. In 1602, Richard Carew' Survey of Cornwall was first published, based on material gathered during the final years of the 16th century. He lists place names within the hundreds of Cornwall, and most settlements are still referred to by their Cornish name. However, Carew tells us that most of the inhabitants can no word of Cornish, so they don't know any Cornish. Yet with regards to English, as to a stranger, they will not speak it. And Carew is mainly known for this quotation, which is the response of the Cornish when faced with an English speaker, which is "Mir na vida causa sausneck." So literally, I do not want to speak Saxonage. However, Carew is from East Cornwall, and therefore, how much knowledge did he actually have of isolated settlements in the west of Cornwall? He's also part of the anglicised elite, a product of that class who did not actively ask for the Book of Common Prayer and Bible to be produced in the previous century. In 1610, James Norman writes a piece called Speculum Magno Britanniae Pars Cornwall, addressed to James I, and he notes that from Truro eastwards is wholly English, which implies that from Truro westwards, Cornish is still the principal language of choice. He remarks that Cornish folk used the language amongst themselves and family, but English for strangers. Then in 1614, Edward Brerewood of Gresham College, London, published Inquiries touching the diversity of languages and religions through the chief parts of the world, in which he mentions Cornish as being spoken. And then in 1630, Sir John Dorridge, in a historical account of the ancient and modern state of the Principality of Wales, Duchy of Cornwall, and Earldom of Chester, comments that Cornwall has a particular language similar to Welsh, but less in use. And then actually in 1632, a Welsh book is printed, which includes Cornish versions of the Lord's Prayer and the Creed. So were these just a merely academic exercise to preserve the language, or because there was a feeling of solidarity in Wales for the Cornish cousins who hadn't received the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible in their own language? But what is becoming clear from these early antiquarians is that Cornish, the use of Cornish, is starting to become more remarkable than commonplace. Okay. The only major piece of literature surviving from the early 17th century is a play called Sgrian Zambis, or The Creation of the World, which, according to the manuscript, it was written by William Jordan of Helston in 1611 and is thought to be based on the earlier Origo Mundi from the Ordinalia, from the earlier mystery plays. However, there are lots of arguments as to why Jordan is or isn't the original author, and the general consensus is coming out that this play was probably written in the mid 16th century, so possibly just after the Reformation. So why was therefore Jordan writing copying this manuscript, which is the extant copy of the play? So he could have been transcribing from an older manuscript, which had been lost, which has since been lost, for a contemporary performance in 1611, or perhaps to save a piece of Cornish literature for posterity. However, what's interesting about this play is that actually it contains a lot of loan words from English, which could place its composition at the beginning of the 17th century, or perhaps Jordan was replacing words from an original manuscript, which by then fallen out of use in Cornish. Another possibility is that by 1611, both Jordan and any potential audience for this play, in comparison with the audience of the Ordinalia 2 centuries before, had moved from being monolingual Cornish speakers to bilingual Cornish and English speakers, who were in fact either beginning to speak or understand a hybrid language as the use of Cornish begins its decline. Jordan was from Helston, as I said, which places the writing of the play, or this copying of this play, in a part of Cornwall still known to mainly speak Cornish at the time it was being written. So a lack of a general corpus of text, especially literary texts, is generally a sign of a language in decline. The English Civil War, mid-17th century, led to many Cornish people becoming uprooted and meant many young men become used to speaking English, despite William Scowen, later in the century, claiming that Cornish was being used by spies during the Civil War, as it could be talked freely and allowed to advantage, to which no other tongue had reference. The Civil War did reach Cornwall. Richard Symonds, a lawyer serving in the Royalist Army, wrote in his notebook about reaching Maheniot and being surprised that the local population spoke Cornish. So he lists Cornish words, nouns, and practical phrases. He also says that the language is spoken altogether at Goonhilly, and about Pendennis and at Land's End they speak no English. All beyond Truro they speak the Cornish language. However, we know that the Royalist Army didn't go much beyond Lostwithiel, so we don't know how reliable a source as to the status of the language at this time Symonds actually is. He might have been garrisoned at Pendennis Castle, or he could have travelled by himself further afield to make these observations. Okay, so Cornwall did fall on the Royalist side in the Civil War, and why was this? Well, two of the main instruments of power within Cornwall, the stannaries and the duchy itself, were direct products of royal power and afforded Cornwall a degree of independence even at this time. These secular institutions, with their links to the crown, might have come under threat from Parliament, and this in turn might have threatened both the economy and the identity of Cornwall. So were the gentry of Cornwall, who, as we've seen, gained position and influence under the Tudors, seeking to protect both their independence and with it the Cornish national identity. So despite the lack of Cornish translations of the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, and in addition to pockets of recusancy, Cornwall remained religiously conservative, and as such the Cornish Anglicanism, which developed over the century since the Reformation, was under threat from a Puritan Parliament. So after aligning themselves with the Crown in the previous century, the Cornish gentry now found themselves under attack, and the positions that they'd gained under attack. So not only did the Civil War period result in Cornishmen returning home having been exposed to non-Cornish speaking English soldiers in the Royalist Army, but Parliament, when they gained power, placed monoglot English speaking clerics within the community. And in addition to this, sort of within the sort of same sort of time frame, Cornish actually starts to begin to be perceived as indicative of a stereotype within contemporary popular culture, perhaps as a result of those 16th century gentry who'd seen the use of Cornish as the way to advance in society. So in a play called The Northern Lass, written in 1632 by Richard Broome, there's a mock Cornish character called Nonsense, who's a gauche, unpolished Cornish gentleman in London who's depicted as being boorish and represented as being able to speak Cornish. So not only the stereotyping starts to come in, but the absence of a thriving literature begins to make Cornish start to seem unimportant. And the Cornish gentry start refusing to speak Cornish with their children so that they won't be handicapped by the language. And by the mid-17th century, Cornish is becoming unusual enough that it's starting to attract attention when it is seen by people coming down from England. So George Fox, the founder of the Religious Society of Friends, and others, wrote a book on linguistics, and he actually includes 18 examples of singular and plural nouns in Cornish. So, it's starting to sort of be seen as an unusual thing rather than, oh, that's Cornwall, that's where they speak Cornish. Other people, so for example, in 1677, John Reed travels to Cornwall, where he pays attention to the language and notes down phrases and proverbs. He mentions Dickon Gwyn of St Just as being the only person who writes in Cornish, but that a Pendarvis has better skills as a scholar. So this is 1667. So this is quite, a century before Dolly Pentreath, supposed last speaker of the language. And in 1676, Cheston Marchant of Gwythian dies at the supposed age of 164. She only says she's the last monoglot speaker of Cornish, according to both Scowen and then later on by William Borlase in the 18th century. And the fact that her death was so recorded, not only this amazing age that she died at, but also that she was a monoglot speaker of Cornish, indicates that it was by then it was really unusual for somebody to be a monoglot speaker of Cornish. You know, that it was noted that she was the last one. However, some people are starting to fight against this. So even this early on, we have this fight back of the language. So Nicholas Boson brought up his children as native speakers, and also made them study Cornish academically. So Boson, who was a pilchard merchant from Newlyn, had been unable to learn the language as a boy, as his mother had forbidden the servants from speaking to him in Cornish, presumably so that he could become more advanced through society. And in 1666, he wrote a book which is very well known called John Chian Horth, which was based on a well-known folk tale, because he learned Cornish as an adult in order to carry out business with fishermen. So the fishermen in Newlyn were still speaking Cornish. And this story is quite important because it teaches that you can learn all the points of Cornish grammar from this one story. And Boson's just one of a group of early antiquarians at this time, including Scowen, who foresaw the death of Cornish and therefore began to band together to study and preserve the language and the literature. So Scowen was working at the Launceston Assizes in 1678, and Lord Chief Justice North, who was the judge there, sort of happened to mention to him, does anything written in Cornish exist? And Scowen mentioned his manuscript, his writing about the reasons for the decline, which in turn led to him preparing a copy of it for the judge. So this ends up in the publication of Antiquarian Cornwall Britannic in 1688. So this book is basically written for an English judge, so it can't appear seditious, but it does contain indirect criticisms of the English and comments on how the actions of the English government and the influence of English culture helped to accelerate the decline of traditional Cornish identity. So, for example, in it, Scowen complains about the decision that all children should learn the Lord's Prayer in English, and that the Book of Common Prayer wasn't produced in Cornish. But he also does realise that many Cornish people wanted to embrace Englishness, but felt that they'd been subjected to an insidious form of English cultural imperialism. So ultimately, Scowen is really important because he gives us a rich discussion of the question of Cornish identity from a contemporary Cornish standpoint at the end of the 17th century. Then at the same sort of time, we get men like John Keigwin and John Boson, who you may have also heard of, begin translating parts of the Bible, the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed into Cornish, as well as noting proverbs and colloquial sentences. So John Keigwin was actually William Scowen's nephew, and he starts revising those medieval plays, so Origen Mundi, Resurrectio Domini, the Passion Poem, Pascha Naganalo. Okay, he translated the bulk of the extant Middle Cornish literature into English for Lord Chief Justice North and Jonathan Trelawney, Bishop of Exeter. And then we get men like William Rowe of Sancreed translating sections of the Bible. John Tonkin, who was a tailor from St Just, starts composing songs in Cornish. And in addition to this creative work, there was preservation work underway. So Thomas Tonkin begins collecting folk songs, and including Delcio Sevi, Strawberry Leaves, which some of you may know. Although there's a question whether Delcio Sevi might actually be a Cornish translation of an English song. So if by the end of the 17th century, English songs are being translated into Cornish, this indicates that Cornish folk songs were already difficult to trace. Yeah. At the beginning of the 18th century, Edward Lloyd arrives in Cornwall. He was keeper of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and was the first qualified scholar to make a serious study of the Cornish language and the other Celtic languages. So he travelled through all of the Celtic nations, studying the philology and history of the languages, and spent about 4 months in Cornwall in the year 1700. However, Lloyd mainly learned his Cornish from antiquarians rather than seeking out native speakers of the language in the areas where it was still being spoken, which is a criticism you can also make of later antiquarians as well. He corresponded with Thomas Tomkin, one of those people trying to preserve the language. And in his Archaeologia Britannica, written or published in 1707, he wrote, there is an introduction in Cornish to the Cornish section, a grammar, and a copy of Nicholas Boson's Joan Hall from 1666. So Lloyd, as a serious scholar, gives a legitimacy to the work of these early antiquarians because he was regarded as such a majorly influential figure by his contemporaries, both within Britain and abroad. But equally, his presence in Cornwall and his work on the language reinforced this declining status of the language. Okay. So moving on a little bit into the 18th century, in 1742, Captain Samuel Barrington took a sailor from Mountbay to Brittany. And this, by speaking Cornish, this sailor was easily understood by the Breton fishermen that they encountered. And this inspired Samuel Barrington's brother Danes to come to Cornwall 20 years later and look for Cornish speakers. So Danes Barrington travelled around West Cornwall with a guide who told him he needed to go to Mousehole, where he would find an old woman who could speak Cornish very fluently. Barrington asks how the guide knows this and was told that it was because he buys fish from her and she would grumble about the price in an unknown tongue to other women in the village. So the account of this follows that Barrington arrives in Mousehole, where he bets that no one could speak Cornish, upon which Dolly Pentreath spoke in an angry tone of voice for 2 or 3 minutes and in a language that sounded very much like Welsh. And there were 2 other women nearby who were laughing at what he said. So Barrington, in his account of this, continues, "Upon this, I asked them whether or not she had been abusing me, to which they answered, very heartily, and because I had supposed she could not speak Cornish. I then said that they must be able to talk the language, to which they answered that they could not speak it readily, but understood it, being only 10 or 12 years younger than Dolly Pentreath." So Barrington sends this account to the Society of Antiquaries, where it was read out in May 1775, and it was then subsequently published in their journal Archaeologia. Several years later, Barrington wrote for news after his visit. Barrington writes for news of Dolly and was told that she was now 87 and remembered him. And we think this is William Borlase who gave this information to her. And he said that she still spoke Cornish as readily as others do English, and that actually from a child she knew no other language and didn't start speaking English until she was 20. Because her father was a fisherman, she was sent with fish to sell them in Penzance when she was 12 and would sell them in the Cornish language. And that the inhabitants in general of Penzance, and even including the gentry, would understand the language. However, by this point, when she's 87, Dolly is positive that there's nobody else in Mousehole or anywhere else who knows anything of it, or at least can understand converse in it. Okay. However, in response to Barrington's inquiries about Dolly, he gets a letter written in Cornish and English by a Mousehole fisherman called William Bodiner. And this is also published in the Archaeologia journal by the Society of Antiquaries. And Bodiner shows that he too had knowledge of the language and claims that 4 or 5 other people in Mousehole speak Cornish, one of whom obviously must have been Dolly. So Dolly Pentreath dies in December 1777. And after her death, Mr. Thompson of Truro writes an epitaph for her in Cornish. However, generally more widely, her death is treated as a bit of a subject of amusement. And even Paul Wheel, sort of writing at the beginning of the 19th century, so sort of just over 20 years later, casts doubt on her ability to speak Cornish. And with the sort of heart of this, the prejudices of the time, dismissed her and refused to believe that an old fish jouster, a fish seller, could have anything to say that would be of interest to men of culture. So the antiquarians who are studying the language, both at the time of its demise in the 17th and 18th centuries, and later on in the 19th century, either regarded Cornish as being in terminal decline already, or only discussed contemporary use of the language with men of the same social class. So our problem is how many Cornish speakers, fluent or otherwise, were disregarded because they were either working class or women, or both. By the time of Dolly Pentreath's death in 1777, it would seem that the use of Cornish as a living language had declined to the point of non-existence. Various surveys do place its use in the coastal communities of the Lizard and the far west of West Penwith. However, we've got examples of William Bodiner and his letter, and the two women of Mouser who were laughing at Dolly Pentreath's comments are examples of other people who could still understand and use the language in the last quarter of the 18th century. So Cornwall, despite the presence of the Stannaries and the Duchy of Cornwall as instruments of power, was officially part of England. And therefore it's to be expected that official documentation would have been produced in the languages understood by those at the heart of power rather than in the local vernacular. English is adopted by the upper classes first, followed swiftly by the mercantile and business classes, precisely because they needed to speak it in order to advance themselves. Later on, Henry Jenner, in the late 19th century, thought that the real reason for the decline of Cornish from the Reformation onwards was a failure to produce the core literature, which is necessary to give language a permanent form. And then as Britain, as a concept, emerges at the beginning of the 18th century after the Act of Union in 1707, Cornwall, and in particular Cornish men, had a role to play in this. And once again, as did their Tudor forefathers, they're emphasising their Britishness as a means of promotion. So this, added to the reasons for the decline of the language discussed, we've talked about, the lack of the continued corpus of literature, the failure of the Bible and the Common Prayer translated into Cornish, the diminishing impossibility and importance of links with Brittany, and the lack of support for the language from the gentry meant that with the loss of the monoglots, Cornish speakers in the 17th century, and the rapid decline of the Cornish speaking areas, despite the efforts of these gentlemen antiquarians and their efforts to recreate a literature in the language, the days of Cornish were clearly numbered. Thank you very much.
Wow, Kensa, thank you ever so much for that really fascinating talk. You'll be delighted to hear that the Facebook Live connected as soon as you started. So hopefully everyone online was able to enjoy the talk too, because I know that lots of people were keen to watch it. So thank you very much. In true Cornish Story Cafe style, we're opening up the floor now to anybody that might have any comments to make, any observations, or any questions that they might have to ask as well. If you don't want to ask a question out loud, you can put it in the chat box, but we are more than happy to have anybody ask a question. I think, have we got a hand raised? I think we have.
Yes, John Mills would like to ask the question if possible, please.
Well, it's more an observation than a question. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk Vocabularium Cornicum and the Bodmin Gospels with the manumissions. And you said that the Bodmin Gospels have a glossary with 961 headwords in it. Actually, you're confusing the two. The manumissions don't contain glosses at all. The 961 word glossary is the Vocabularium Cornicum. The manumissions only contain the details of the slaves that were manumitted, and that several of those, many of those have Cornish names, and that's the amount of Cornish that's in the Bodmin Gospels. There was something else I wanted to mention. You're talking about Llywyd, and you said that he was getting his data from the gentry. Llywyd himself said he got most of his data from John Cegwin, and he had the copies of the Passion poem, the Ordinalia, and Jordan's Geraeans and Biz, which Cegwin translated, and Bishop Jonathan Trelawney gave copies of those to Cegwin, to Llywyd, and Llywyd then, when he came down to Cornwall, spent a lot of time with Cegwin, and that is the major source of his Cornish vocabulary in National Library of Wales. I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at that. I was looking at it recently, and I was going through that manuscript vocabulary of Llywyd's, looking specifically for phrases and short example sentences, of which there are several. And most of those, the vast majority of those, are taken from Jordan's Geraeans and Biz, Creation of the World. But there are none which come from later than line round about 850 of the play. So I conclude from that Llywyd hadn't read the whole of the play, that he had extracted his vocabulary only from the first part of that, and not so much from the Ordinalia and the Passion poem. Of course, he used other sources as well. That's all I wanted to say.
Oh, no, brilliant. Thank you very much. We've got a comment on Facebook from Lemmy Mitchell, who's commented that it's a shame that so much early Kenuric writing was lost or destroyed. So that's a comment directly from your talk there, Kensa. We've got a question from Facebook. Do we know much about the knowledge of Cornish amongst Methodists? And that's from Howard on Facebook. I
have no idea. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Anybody else? Any ideas? People that may know? No, maybe that's something that we need to have a think about or look into. Steve is interested in what Kensa has found out about the late 19th century remnants of Cornish. If you're willing to talk about that, Kensa.
I've not obviously been able to get into archives for the past year. In terms of actually doing research on my PhD, that is something I need to do.
Yeah, it's you've been severely restricted, haven't you, by COVID, which is a huge shame. I can see Tim Hannigan's got his hand up. Tim, have you got something to ask or comment to make?
Miraz Kensa, thank you. That was brilliant. It was a rip-roaring tour through the history of the decline of the Cornish language. I had a couple of things. First was just a very simple one. That play you mentioned, The Northern Lass, with the stereotype Cornish character. What was the year of that play again?
I would need to look at. I think it was at 1636.
I was busily scribbling down the name of the character in the play, and I missed the date.
Yeah. Go on. Ask me another question while I.
All right. Yeah. Well, I had just a little observation. I thought the observation about the opening of the sea routes and the significance of that in fostering English was a really significant one. I think possibly one that sometimes gets overlooked, and it just made me think of the fact that the Isles of Scilly, Cornish was gone from there at a very early stage, presumably because of its sort of being tied so well into sea routes. So I just thought that was an interesting thing. Then my kind of other question leads on really into what I think is the focus of your research, which, as you just said, then you haven't really been able to get into that much. And it's about the idea that once you get beyond, well, even once you get into the kind of Dolly Pentreath era, but certainly beyond, when people go hunting for scraps of Cornish surviving, just wondered what you thought about the fact that there seems to probably be a certain confusion between Cornish language and Cornish dialect. There's a line in W.H. Hudson's book from sort of 1907 or whatever it is, where he encounters somebody on the beach at Sennen who he cannot understand a word of what they're saying, and a younger man with better, more sort of proper English says, oh, he's speaking proper Cornish. So I wondered how you're going to kind of negotiate that ambiguity. You know, all these stories that you get from like 1899, that, oh yeah, my granny spoke Cornish perfectly well in the 1840s. How do you negotiate that ambiguity about all of those stories and anecdotes, whether they were really speaking Cornish or just sort of proper Cornish, as Hudson calls it?
So to answer your first question, the Northern Lass was 1632.
Brilliant, cheers.
Yes, that's going to be interesting. A lot of things which I have managed to see do tend to separate dialect and language. So even early on in the 19th century, they're talking about dialect terms as opposed to the language. And you do get sort of dictionaries of Cornish words, but also dialect phrases as well. The problem obviously are those anecdotal, my granny knows somebody who 60 years ago talked about their great granny who was speaking in Cornish, and without any sort of written evidence, how can we use that? So yeah, that's going to be fun.
Thanks.
Thank you ever so much for that. Kensa, we have so many questions and comments. Your talk has obviously spurred a lot of interest in people, which is brilliant. So thank you for that. We've got John, who I think is in the Zoom. He says, thank you, Kensa. Have you had a chance to examine any legal documents, wills, conveyances, probate? Were these documented in Cornish at any stage? And if so, is there a date from which the language changes?
I haven't. So yeah, not yet. Yeah,
it's a good question. I have to admit, I was wondering as well.
I would think ever such a lot of the legal documents are in Latin. Certainly, legal documents that I've come across so far have been in Latin.
Fair enough. Brilliant. Lemmy, who we heard from earlier on Facebook, she wants to know what is the most interesting unknown fact that you found while researching. So, what was really interesting to you, or perhaps surprised you?
Oh. Gosh, I can't. Oh, off the top of my head, I can't think.
Have a think about it, and
I'll have a think
read out
about
a few. Putting you on the spot, aren't we? Really. So Suzanne comments that she heard that the Trewilas were the last Cornish family to speak the language. So that's an interesting comment or opinion there. And Daniel wants to ask a question about hybrid language and bilingualism. So, Daniel.
Yeah, one of the way, Mras Kensa of Cornwall. Thank you very much for your talk. I just wanted to, because you mentioned hybrid language in grains and beers, and I've rather seen this as a kind of an instance of code switching or incorporating certain loan words rather than actually a hybrid language, because we see these instances of code switching as early as the Ordinalia, and especially also in Bone and Ski and stuff. So I have the kind of hypothesis that bilingualism was actually quite widespread in Cornwall for a long period of time, that the late 16th and early 17th century saw a kind of a switch away from transmitting the language to the next generation. And I don't know, I'd sort of take issue, it depends on the definition, of course, of what you call a hybrid language, whether the incorporation of loan words already constitutes a hybrid language, because otherwise the Cornish forms and everything in grains and beers are completely sort of purely Cornish, just with a few English words and some sections added. And this was going on for a while. So I kind of hypothesized that bilingualism was a fact of Cornish life for a long time. Do you have any information on that, or do you?
I mean, it's certainly, if you look at the decline of other languages, which are far better documented than Cornish, you see this with pretty much every other language that starts declining and dying out, that you get this idea of you go from a monoglot population, which then the next generation, I mean, it's not in this doesn't happen in one generation and then it's the next generation are bilingual speakers, and then eventually the subsequent generation are monolingual speakers of the new language, which is generally the more powerful language coming in from a neighbouring area, so English in the case of Cornish. I mean, that doesn't happen in the case of 3 generations, as you say. That's happening over the course of, you know, decades, if not hundreds of years. You know, and that has been documented with other languages. So I think, you know, you're right. I think we have to assume that that is what happened with Cornish, that, you know, we went through a stage of probably 150, 200 years of this bilingual population.
Yeah.
And that subsequent generations knew less and less Cornish as they went on.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So Kensa, a few comments from Facebook, and then I think Dr. Mills has got his hand up again. I haven't missed you, Dr. Mills, sorry. So from Facebook, it says, it's very interesting and highly detailed. Thank you from the state of Georgia. Somebody else, David Downing, said, Miraz Kensa, for sharing your work. And he's watching in Minnesota, USA. So we're really reaching the diaspora tonight, which is great. And then from Facebook as well, Guy Watson, who I think might be a little bit more local, said that it was a really useful talk and he's learned loads. So that's good. Tammy Tradinic, which is a great Cornish name, but she says, good day from the USA. And I think there's quite a few comments on our CHT Facebook page, so you might want to have a look at that later, Kensa, and see if there's some things on there. So Dr. Mills, I think you've been very patient with your hand up. Are you there? Don't know if you may be muted. No? Okay. Anything else that anybody wants to ask? Anybody wants to make any more comments or observations?
Yes, I'd like to ask, did you come across John Davy? Because he's supposedly a speaker of Cornish who died as late as 1914, apparently, and was able to speak Cornish. Have you got any information on him?
I was actually started researching him last week. Obviously, we've literally been able to get back in archives for I think 2 weeks. So yeah, I started on him last week.
Oh, fantastic! I'd be very eager to hear about that.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Thank you very much. I think there's one more comment just come through, and it's from Will Orchard, and it says, every academic has to demonstrate why their research is important. Although your PhD isn't yet published, what new ground does your thesis break? Or is that trade secret for the time being?
It'll be trade secrets for the time being. Yeah.
Watch this space might be the answer there. Oh, and another question. We're not going to let you go quite yet, Kensa. Sorry. It says, great talk, Kensa. Has there been any forensic analysis of the earliest documents, which might give a number of interesting insights? And that's
so actually, the Bodmin manumissions, Oliver Padell and a team are actually at the moment. He gave a talk at. We had a conference last autumn run sort of jointly by the Institute and the Academy Kennewick and Cornwall Council. And he spoke about work that's actually happening on the Bodmin manumissions at the moment. And because of the sort of increased techniques that are available nowadays for analysing documents, so that they found extra words that were sort of hidden in, sort of using your naked eye looking at these documents. But now with sort of better techniques, that they've been able to scan them and they're finding more information. So they've actually sort of got more names of these slaves on there. So he gave us a talk about that. And I think that there's a lot more research coming out of that, which is due to be published either later this year or next year. So that's something to look out for.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got one last question, and it's from, the reason I'm reading it out is it's from the person who ran the first Story Cafe for us in this series. So it's from Merv Davey, and he's asking if any research has been done on Cornish language mining terms.
Mining towns or
terms, sorry, terms, that was my fault.
Oh yes, so there's a whole dictionary of it's completely slipped my mind, somebody will know. Price is sort of encyclopedia of mining terms, and there's certainly something that I'm coming across in the bits of research that I've been able to do over the past year, again and again and again, that Cornish terms for mining and geological features were just continuously in use. And actually something that I learned when I was learning Cornish, because my Cornish teacher was a geologist, is that actually ever so many geological terms that are still in use today, the official term has come from the Cornish language.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kensa. That was fantastic, and that really was the most questions and comments that we've had in a Story Cafe. So thank you very much for your willingness to talk to everybody. I hope that everyone that's here this evening has enjoyed the Story Cafe. We really appreciate you all coming along and taking part this evening, which has been brilliant. I'd like to thank Kensa again for her incredible talk. Thank the Cornwall Community Foundation for supporting the event, and also my colleagues who made this evening happen and gained probably a fair few grey hairs in the process in the background. The video of this evening's Story Cafe will be available on our website next week, so watch this space. We will let you all know when it's available to view. This is the last in the current series of virtual Story Cafes. However, we already have exciting plans for some real life events starting in September. So please keep an eye out for those. Thank you to everybody that's helped to make our virtual Story Cafes a success. We are really grateful, and they've been really well received. So thank you very much to everybody for that. One of the great things about the virtual cafes has been the ability for people from all over the world to join us. As we've heard this evening, we've been popular in the USA tonight, and to share the stories. So we will endeavour to continue to make that possible. We promise that you won't miss out, because it's really important to us that everybody gets to share all of these things that we're finding out about Cornwall's heritage, whether it's scoot dancing or the language. We know that you enjoy it, and we will do our best to enable you to share it with us. So for now, thank you all again for your support. Stay safe, take care, and good evening. Thank you very much for all coming.